Welcome everybody to this webinar, how BYOD will enable the new workforce beyond 2020. Certainly a timely topic to say the least. My name is Sean Winter. I'm Global Vice President of Client Success for Movius, and I'm joined today by a great friend and partner, James Wang, Senior Business Development Manager at BlackBerry. James, how are you today?
Doing great, and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
How are things up in Toronto? You're right outside of Toronto, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just telling Gene that we had a week of unseasonably warm weather, so we certainly will take it. But now it's back to normal, so back to the grind sort of thing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thanks for being here. I know BlackBerry has a long history and a ton of expertise in this space, and so I'm interested in mining your brain as to, certainly not only what's gone on given the last 8 months or so with the pandemic, but where we're going to go moving forward.
Absolutely, and I think BYO is a perfect topic for this, so I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Well, let's start with, the I guess from the aspect of the remote worker. We're obviously seeing concerns from the business end that they just need to keep businesses functioning. But from the remote worker, it's certainly challenging, right? They're using their own. We're seeing increases in phishing attacks. We're seeing difficulty in terms of getting hardware and other tools maybe out to employees. VPNs are getting workers, obviously aren't going back to the office yet in most cases. That's challenging. And then eventually we'll probably get to a world where they're in the office, maybe a few days a week, at home a few days a week. So from your perspective, what technologies do you think organizations need to invest in order to enable the new workforce? And I hate the new normal term, but I do think we're gonna get into something that does look different than it looked 8 months ago. We're not just gonna go back to the way things were. So what technologies are high on
I think that's a great question, and there are a lot of parts. I'll take a couple of cuts at different aspects of that. I think maybe to set it up, there's been perhaps like a phase one type response to the pandemic, right? You've got, instead of maybe 10 to 25% of your workforce, there are typical assumptions built into things like how many VPN licenses you might need, or how many devices that you need to send out, or this, that, the other thing. And that got flipped completely on its head, right? So now you're probably talking about maybe it's 80 to 90% of your work in places that you wouldn't normally expect, whether it be home, whether it be some sort of maybe you're borrowing an office somewhere, or those types of things. The assumptions behind it, I think when the existing systems were built, they were built on prior assumptions. And that, when the pandemic hit, I think a lot of people tried to get those already in place. And that's a very natural, response. You're trying to keep your head above water. You're trying to make sure that your employees are productive, functional, all those things that kind of go along with that. But you don't have the time to redesign your entire network topology, as an example. You don't have buy 40 different VPN concentrated and all those sorts of things. You're just trying to keep things going, right? So I think the first part of that is prior, and then what are the assumptions now, given that I guess there was the old normal, right? Everyone going into work, and a couple of remote people, that sort of thing. The new normal being a couple of people going in, so you kind of have both. And then my guess, hopefully with the vaccine on the horizon, there's probably going to be a hybrid normal, if I can coin a new term, which is maybe half and half, or kind of like what you said. Some people for some days, others their home office is that, those types of things. And those assumptions, I wouldn't say they changed dramatically, but now they shift as well, right? So I think when you get into that space, what was before and what people thought about before, and that was probably your office was that secure area. You can easily bar physical access. You can easily bar an intruder from coming in. All your assets are well protected. Into this new world, it's every user everywhere, right? And having that as an assumption actually changes the way that you approach tech. So you have to kind of go away from trusting in physical security, trusting in the ability to say, hey, once I've, badged into my building, I am who I am and all those sorts of things. You move into a space of perhaps it's more towards zero trust. You don't trust everyone at all times. And you move to nation, right? So depending on what you do, do you open this app and not this app? Do you normally log in from Starbucks? That can inform the way that you have access to this critical enterprise data, right? So I think
so it's not just the so and so leaves their phone in the back of the Uber. Yeah. It's now, I'm interested. It's now this notion of what are the normal behaviors of the person, and using that sort of in more of an AI way to understand if it's the right person.
Absolutely. There's a change in the way of looking at security in the sense of maybe being predictive as opposed to reactive, right? Knowing kind of all the things that we know, being able to put together vast amounts of different types of information, and then being able to action upon that as required. So I think if you take one more step back from that, I think the bigger is making sure that you build an assumption of security in given that of new normal means that of course you mentioned phishing as an example. You want the productivity of people everywhere, but because now the actors are out there knowing that everyone is everywhere, there are many more points that are exposed that people are going to try to take advantage of, right? And whether that be handsets, whether that be BYO, laptops, whether that be the network in Starbucks, et cetera, having that many new points of exposure means you've got to take a look at skill. My take on this is you got to make sure and build that in up front, because I think today we'll talk a little bit about that resilient organization, how to be really flexible, scalable, and provide tools to end users. So I think there's a big piece to that. So I'll leave it at that for now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at it from sort of the tooling perspective. And we know that, mobile has certainly around for some time and certainly been accelerated as a must-have. And then that kind of lead is it the company's responsibility to provide every possible tool, or are we going, smartphones, the obvious one, but Starbucks networks, personally owned laptops, etc. So aside from, companies need to figure this out because of the pandemic piece, take a step back from that for a second, and BYO as a model. And I'd love to understand from you, based on your expertise, what are some of the benefits of this model? Again, aside from everyone's home, so we have to do this. We look at it more proactive in terms of strategic lens in the future. What are some of the benefits that companies can bring your own technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's one corollary to that, which is what's the current model, or what are the other models that are out there, right? And certainly there are pros and cons to both, right? So I'll highlight the first one being, for example, corporately owned, which is maybe very traditional, right? That's where a lot of these companies come from. Companies manage the assets, they pay for the assets, and it's very clear why that was the model in the past. Right? It's easy to say, for example, we're going to buy 1,000 Dell laptops. They're all going to be configured exactly the same. They all use Windows 10. They all use this build. They have all these patches, et cetera, right? The sense of homogeneous type, hardware sorts of things. Clearly, there are a lot of benefits to that. Being able to control that, push that out. I think it's also very closely linked to a concept of a physical spell, right? Because then you can pull kind of all those aspects of what a worker does during their day. Physical access to a workspace. The types of tools that you hand out to them. Assumption of being able to literally hand it to somebody, right? So there's kind of that piece when it comes to corporately owned. So certainly there's a lot of benefits to that, but you look at this world now. Why is BYO even at? So I guess there's a sense maybe dual personas for end users, right? Consumer, Sean the consumer, for Movius or not, you're going to have your own phone, right? Whether you Movius or not, you're going to have your own kind of laptop or, this, that, the other thing. So there's a side to Sean that, would go out there and, whatever, get a tablet or, laptops and all those sorts of things. So you're really going to have those types of, toys. I'll put that in quotes, but you have choice. You have one, and you have an ability to, get the latest and greatest specifically for your needs, right? And that's completely, the things. But now the lockdowns and all those sorts of things, it's not necessarily easy to get you new hardware. It's not always easy to and be able to control all those sorts of things. So a natural extension of that is you want to take advantage of that hardware that you have, in your consumer persona, but in a way that allows you to be productive from an enterprise perspective. And again, I'll go back to that. There's now you go into this environment where Sean have let's say you love Apple products, so you've got an iPhone and iPad, everything, but your teammates might love your teammates might love Google products or Windows, or there's just a broad variety of things that people love. And a big challenge when you go into that BYO space is being able to put tools across and that sort of thing. So when you get into that, really got to make sure you take into consideration how I wouldn't say the same, but similar type experiences across that variety of hardware and software as well, right? And underlying all of that is the security aspect of that, right? You have critical enterprise data that you just cannot let, your kids might play with your phone, they might play games and, jump onto Facebook or this, that, the other thing. So you just don't want that cross-contaminating the enterprise data. That's a big key there.
No, and that makes sense. We have a lot of personal experience with this at Movius when we need to come out with I started here, just how many different operating systems across different devices. It's not one app by any means. It's a very complicated matrix. So yeah, I get what you're talking about. And yes, we do have to account posters that they're Google products for sure.
Absolutely.
I'm an Apple guy here on the East Coast though. So let's talk about it's a good segue into BlackBerry's digital workplace, right? And your work from anywhere model that you all have embraced. And we're partners with you. For you on the call that don't know, Movius Multiline is a secondary business phone number that can be delivered via an app on your personal phone. So you still have all your personal stuff, your texting, your apps, everything you want, and then we can actually deliver a phone that can do texting and voice calls either directly to the phone or through a container like BlackBerry's UEM. So it basically puts a desk phone in your pocket, as we like to say. So I would like to, James, understand from your perspective, when you think about the needs of remote workers in BYO, how does Movius and BlackBerry's digital workplace from a solution perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that one. And I think, just a little bit of quick history. When the pandemic hit, a lot of this technology already in place, right? So, even prior to knowing, this, looking into the future, we could never have predicted, this type of circumstance. But, having the technologies to put together to allow for remote working certainly, was in the BlackBerry bag, right? So what we did at the time of, the initial pandemic and all the lockdowns and stuff like that, launch our digital workplace productivity bundle, right? So as part of that, we had a couple of components. Number one, a secure browser that basically allowed access to things like your corporate email, your corporate calendar, secure browsing, for example, if you have intranet type resources that you had internally, and as well an ability to access remote desktops. So whether you had like a VDI that you needed to use, or if you were, for example, doing CAD drawing, a different computer, those sorts of things, we had a way to basically allow you to do that, right? So the way that I think about it was office in a box, right? And one other piece here, particularly I think for folks with Mobius, I think they think about it handset perspective initially. I think that's probably the first place that they normally think about that. There's also the desktop client from a Mobius perspective. And I think if you think about Office in a box, from the BlackBerry bundle perspective, and then you add an ability to be reached anywhere at any time on your office number. I think that's the perfect setup for the remote. And, licenses, you don't need to do a lot of work to enable BYO. You still want to have a security layer, but you want to be able to do all those email calendar, intranet, while have a phone number where people can reach you. So for me, that's the perfect setup for a worker.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. We've seen a ton of interest, especially from industries, be it healthcare, government, financial services. Those employees, let's say an investment banker, were highly dependent on the ability to get to that secure, compliant, recordable desk phone every day. And now they can't. In fact, that our partnership allows them to basically do that on the device they already have at home. Is certainly, and do it in a compliant and secure way is certainly hugely powerful.
Absolutely. I'll jump in with one other quick thought here, and more from an ROI perspective this way. If you as an are paying a pretty good sum to enable a hard desk phone right now in somebody's office, it's probably very impractical right now. Like you're just paying for in that sense, if you could number one, digitize it and allow it to be portable, still have all the security, like you were mentioning, the being able to record the voice calls, or those sorts of things, those type of hard requirements that you just can't get away from. Being able to digitize that and put it in somebody else's home office, or or those types of things, very, very powerful. And not only powerful, can save you a lot of money, right? So I just wanted to put that out there, because if people are just paying for sitting there right now that's not being used, what else could you be doing with that, right? So I just want to put that out there.
And we can easily repurpose that number as well, so you don't even have to change your business cards or whatever number your clients have. We can make sure that comes through to your phone.
Absolutely. For sure.
Well, it's funny you bring up all this, because the next question I wanted to move into was the notion of resiliency. You brought that up earlier. And I think it's interesting because, we do a lot of ROI work with our customers. And when you start at the top level of any company, right, it's usually about how can we generate more revenue, or how can we control costs, right? Can we add to the top, or can we? And now I think we're seeing resiliency, business continuity at that top level of operations everywhere. So I would say going into 2021, any advice or tips you have struggling with this that maybe I don't want to say they put business continuity and resiliency on the back burner, because I don't think companies do that. But now it's certainly very much at the forefront. Any advice from you or your firm as to how thinking about that going into 2021 as they're doing their imperatives for the coming year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mentioned kind of a phase one type response earlier, right? Like just making sure you can kind of keep everything going forward. You use what you've got, you expand upon what you got, sort of thing. I think now that we've got a relatively good understanding of, what the, in quotes, the new normal looks like, I think it's time to take a step back and really kind of just, understand that implies, from an infrastructure perspective, from a perspective, from even, maybe that argument of BYO versus corporate as well. There's a lot of stuff that kind of goes alongside of that. I think now is the perfect time to talk about, what a phase two type deployment when it comes to, planning your technology for 2021 should look like, right? So I think we've talked a lot about these various themes, but things like, scalability, whether that be, transitioning things from, on-premise to in the cloud, to be able to support the large number of workers that, shifted from, in-office type work to, everywhere, every time, at all times, sort of thing. There's an aspect of scalability. There's an aspect of security, for sure. You have to think about that now, right? Like I'll give you an example, right? It's easy to say we're just going to add more licenses to the VPN as one very concrete example, potentially very costly as well as you scale. But maybe the other question is need a VPN in the first place, right? Just to kind of switch it up, like why do I need the VPN? There was a assumption built into that you have a few remote workers at any one time, that sort of thing. But imagine you could have technology that you connected to your enterprise network, but in a safe and secure manner, right? Monitoring, for example, for malware, phishing attacks and those sorts of things, take continuous authentication and, building in a zero trust model, et cetera, those sorts of things. I think there's a space to be able to go and ask yourselves those types of questions. Like, how do I move away from traditional, maybe, a react proactive type model where I can kind of make sure that, I got Sean at all times, and I can really just make sure that he's got the tools that he needs to be successful, right? So I think that's part of the resilient organization and how you plan for 21.
Yeah, so it reminds me of, years ago, I think corporate IT, we went through this big shift of moving from a group that provided, hardware-based items to a group that needed to understand how to operate as a service provider. And I think this is another evolution on top of that. Hey, the services now just aren't how do we get things cleanly out to people in a building. It's how to actually manage a fully remote workforce that needs to not only have access to the right tools at the right time, but in a safe and secure way. So I think that
absolutely. It's a seismic shift in terms of, and I keep going back to it, but it's a seismic shift in terms of the assumptions, right? So I don't think anybody would say that we're going to go back to what we did before. There's certainly, new tools, new ways of gaining productivity, new ways of doing business that are certainly that it's good. It's good. We got kind of pushed off the ledge into into this remote working type environment, but there are lessons to be learned, and we got to kind of adapt to these different circumstances, take advantage of the tools that are out there, and you never thought of them before because you kind of just coasted along based on knowing that what was happening before is what's going to happen again, right? But the pandemic just turned everything upside down. So it's a good time to reevaluate your assumptions. And if I was to say anything, I would say don't think about security as a bolt-on, kind of like VPNs. Like there's something that you add on afterwards. But I think particularly for security, you have to build in that assumption right at the very beginning. It's got to be part of what you do because now everybody is everywhere. There's no getting away from that.
That makes sense. A few questions from the audience here that I'd like to mix in. And for any of you listening, if you do have a question, just use the Q&A. We're certainly monitoring that. The first one is, in your experience, as companies say, hey, maybe I don't need to be in the device business anymore, right? Maybe I'm a bank, or why am I in the phone business? Everyone has a phone anyway. And maybe that's the driving point. Maybe now it's cost focused, right? If we're in a recession, companies are going to be tighter on spending anyway. In your experience, James, how long does it for a company to move to a true BYO program?
Yeah.
Is that kind of a cyclical thing, where as different contracts come up, you sort of get out of them, or is it typically more of, we have an ELA, whomever, that ends on this date, and so we're going to all in?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of pieces to that. Certainly, if you're an extremely large financial institute, it can take multi-years, right? Just because they have all these different groups and different use cases that sometimes may point to a corporately owned type model. Whereas maybe a more mid-sized firm can get a little bit of flexibility. I think part of that as well, there's a sense of a management that goes behind that, in the sense of how do you manage these devices, whether they be corporately owned or whether they be or somewhere in between as well, right? So I think you've got to be able to build out the roadmap on where that goes first before you really kind of dive into that. Yeah. And the other piece of it as well, I think there's a push aspect to this, right? I think employees naturally, if you kind of open the floodgates, you probably push them toward. They're probably the ones pushing towards a BYO type model, right? Most people are like, hey, I've got if you're doing corporately owned now, they go, hey, I'm holding two devices. It's really inefficient. Why would I have two phones? I get one phone on this side, and I don't know if it's a work one or if it's like my personal one. So yeah. I think there's a natural push from the consumer, and I think for customers, they really think about how they manage that BYO type of deployment, particularly around security and in that space. I think the contract aspect of it is not that big of a deal. I mean, you can probably handle the rollouts, and as one contract ends, you can switch to BYO and all those sorts of things. It's really around building out the policy as well as the ways to be able to manage the switch over to BYO. So you've got to do that homework first. I think that's the biggest piece. And as long as you don't have like 100,000 employees, it can be relatively quick. I think I've seen these handled in as short as about 6 months, and typically maybe up to a year, right? Like you're changing a mindset, you're changing the way that people work. So
that's what we noticed. We noticed there's a huge emotional connection between people and devices,
Absolutely.
which is crazy. And some, to your point, some jumping in with open arms saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sick of devices. One's a paperweight. Doesn't the best interest of my company from a spending perspective." But others are can be a bit more concerned about sort of the personal and enterprise information on the same device, even though we have great solutions to protect for that.
And that's kind of what I mean when you have to think about the policies. I think you raise a good point there, right? Like there probably are privacy concerns, right? So how do I, the mixing of personal and enterprise type data, who gets to see what, is there any sorting that goes along with that? What sort of policies do you have with that? So certainly it's not going to be, it's not clear in black and white, just, on day one sort of thing. You really have to think through that. And, what are the policies, as well as what are the legal requirements, for companies when it comes to respecting, end user privacy and stuff like that. So it's a very good point.
Good deal. Well, we are just about at the end of time. James, I want to thank you for taking your time. You've always been a great partner of ours at Movius. And as you can see on the screen, for those of you watching, if you're interested in a BYO consultation, right? We all know that everyone's home now and they have laptops and computers and phones and networks and all these things that we can certainly help your company make the most of in a very cost-effective way. So contact us at moviuscore.com and we'll be sure to connect you with our partners at BlackBerry, whomever else we need to bring into the mix to come up with the right solution for you.
Thank you.
So James, I want to thank you for your time, your partnership, and we will chat soon. Everybody stay safe out there.
Thanks so much. Pleasure.
Thanks, James.
Thanks.